entre Puerto Rico y Estados Unidos, a consecuencia de la imposición de las leyes de cabotaje federales, tomando como base el informe presentado por el Government Accountability Office, GAO, el 14 de marzo del 2013. En esta tarde tenemos como primer deponente al señor Michael Hansen del Hawaii Shipping Council, vía electrónica, la primera vez que se hace aquí en el Senado de Puerto Rico y la primera vez que obtenemos información por parte de algunas jurisdicciones que están tratando de eliminar las leyes de cabotaje. He empezado en español en la ponencia, voy a seguirla en inglés. Sin embargo, tenemos una persona que puede traducirle a cualquiera de los que está en el público o cualquiera de los otros senadores que vengan a ser parte de esta vista. So, Mr. Hansen, good afternoon. My name is Rosanna Lopez, the chairman of the Civil Rights, Citizen Participation and Social Economy Committee of the Senate of Puerto Rico. Thank you for being here, and on behalf of us, members of the Senate of Puerto Rico, I want to thank you for your response, your support, and the response to our petition to participate in this public hearing, in which we are analyzing the Senate Resolution 237 on cabotage law. Thank you for your participation. You can now start your testimony, and when you finish, I will be asking you some questions regarding the issue. You can start, Mr. Hansen.
Thank you. Good day, Chairman Lopez and distinguished members of the committee. I am Michael Hansen, President of the Hawaii Shippers Council, testifying in support of Senate Resolution 237. We have previously submitted written testimony. The Hawaii Shippers Council is a business league organization incorporated in 1997 to represent the interests of those cargo owners formally and legally known as shippers. The goal of the Hawaii Shippers Council is to promote the most efficient ocean shipping services for Hawaii. This goal extends to the other non-contiguous jurisdictions of the United States, i.e. Alaska, Guam, and Puerto Rico, as they are inextricably linked by the federal cabotage laws. Because of the common regulatory situation, we believe the best approach to Jones Act reform is to include the 4 non-contiguous jurisdictions and seek a common solution that would create a single coherent regulatory regime. Together, the 4 jurisdictions would have greater political effectiveness in seeking reform to federal cabotage, and a common reform solution would be more attractive to federal legislators and regulators than a piecemeal approach. A common reform solution would also create a larger market and foster greater competition in ocean shipping for the non-contiguous trades, as those ship owners who acquire vessels complying with the new set of reformed rules would have the option of trading them in 4 different trade lanes. The non-contiguous jurisdictions are unique in the nation, as they are completely reliant upon ocean shipping for interstate surface transportation. The 48 states comprising the contiguous United States, also known as Kansas, the mainland, and the lower 48, have many interstate surface transportation alternatives. Those include railroad, road truck, inland barge, and pipeline transportation, which substantially mitigate the impact of the nation's cabotage laws. There are several federal cabotage laws that regulate a variety of domestic maritime activities. The most important, and the one that we are addressing today, is Section 27 of the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, commonly known as the Jones Act. It regulates the carriage of cargo and is the main focus of our reform effort and your resolution. Together with federal vessel documentation laws, the Jones Act requires that a vessel be U.S. built, U.S. flag, U.S. crewed, U.S. owned, U.S. managed, and never rebuilt in a foreign place in order to transport merchandise by water between two domestic points. As the resolution states, the territory of Guam is exempt from the U.S. build requirement of the Jones Act, which is commonly known as the Guam exemption. However, this Guam exemption is of limited usefulness as the natural westbound trade lane from the U.S. West Coast passes through Honolulu, effectively shackling Guam to the U.S. build requirement for its interstate trade. The Hawaii Shippers Council has put forward a Jones Act reform proposal that would exempt the non-contiguous trades from the U.S. build requirement, and we welcome support from the other non-contiguous jurisdictions, including Puerto Rico. The cost of building large ocean-going self-propelled ships in the United States, as required by the federal cabotage laws, is now 4 to 5 times the cost of building a comparable ship in Japan or South Korea. This extraordinary U.S. shipbuilding cost has many ramifications. It restricts domestic ship construction, creates an artificial scarcity of ships, erects very high barriers to entry for the domestic, coastal, and non-contiguous trades, effectively restricting competition, and has resulted in an aging and inefficient Jones Act fleet, including in the non-contiguous trades. Your instant resolution references the Government Accountability Office's report on the characteristic of the island's maritime trade and potential effects of modifying the Jones Act, which was issued in March of last year. That report avoided drawing many obvious conclusions, especially in respect of the liner container trade between the U.S. mainland and Puerto Rico. The GAO said that they could not obtain operating data and comparative freight rates to evaluate this sector of the Puerto Rican trade, which is a significant shortcoming of that report. In contrast, in their report on the competitiveness of the Puerto Rico economy, issued in June of 2012, the Federal Reserve Board of New York, commonly known as the New York Fed, was able to obtain comparable freight rates to find the difference between foreign flag rates from the U.S. mainland to Caribbean destinations other than Puerto Rico significantly and the rates to Puerto Rico significantly higher than those to the other destinations. There should really be no problem in obtaining comparative freight rates to assess the differences between Jones Act and international rates in the Caribbean. Responding to the GAO and New York Fed reports, the Jones Act Industry Trade Association in Puerto Rico, La Alianza Maritima de Puerto Rico, commissioned their own study. This report was issued as the Maritime Industry in Puerto Rico in May of 2013 and was written by Estudios Técnicos, Inc. That report essentially said that the higher Jones Act freight rates between Puerto Rico and the U.S. mainland are offset by the highly dependable nature of the domestic liner container services. We do not believe that this conclusion is credible and should be more closely examined. In addition to the liner container trades, there are the tramp bulk trades that carry commodities from the U.S. mainland to Puerto Rico. They include dry bulk cargoes such as animal feed, grains, wheat, rice, and fertilizers, and liquid bulk cargoes such as petroleum products. The GAO report suggests that a liberalization of the cabotage rules would significantly improve this sector and benefit Puerto Rico. Again, an exemption from the U.S. build requirement for the non-contiguous trades would address the issue of the shortage of tonnage indicated by the GAO in the bulk trades, and would possibly be the best reform option for that sector. A close examination of this sector should prove valuable to identify specific reform measures that would provide economic relief for the Commonwealth. Thank you for the opportunity to testify in favor of Senate Resolution 237.
Thank you, Mr. Hansen. I have some questions based in your testimony today, and because you did all other lines, I will address another one later. So the first question is, in your testimony you talk about creating new public policy. What kind of public policy do you propose in order to reform the Jones Act to create a single and coherent regulatory regime?
Thank you, Senator. The Hawaii Shippers Council has proposed that the non-contiguous trades, that is the domestic trade lanes between the U.S. mainland, Alaska, Guam, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico, be exempted from the U.S. build requirement of the Jones Act. We believe that this single measure would increase competition and make many more vessels available.
So your proposal is only to that, or are you asking to eliminate the Jones Act at all?
Yes, we don't believe that it would be possible to fully exempt the non-contiguous trades from the Jones Act because there's too much political resistance. And we're focusing on the build issue because that is the main cost driver in the non-contiguous trades because of the very high cost of major shipbuilding in the United States.
How will it possibly reflect in the trade operation if we can trade with ships that have been constructed by other international shipbuilders, such as Japan, for example?
Yes, the cost of constructing a major ship in the United States is now 5 times the cost for building a comparable ship in either South Korea or Japan. Between Japan, South Korea, and China, they build more than 90% of the ocean-going ships in the world today. The differential between this differential in cost has been recently verified by 2 well-respected maritime consultancy groups, that being Alpha Liner and Drewry Shipping Consultancies. So there's really no question that the cost of shipbuilding in the United States is a very large factor in all of this.
In your testimony, you said too that the Jones Act restricts the rebuilding of vessels outside of the territory. Can you explain more about this particular issue?
Yes, this is what's known as the second proviso of the Jones Act. It's a separate legislation that was passed after the Jones Act, and what it states is that if you take your Jones Act ship to a foreign shipyard, you can only do very limited reconstruction of the ship in that foreign shipyard, and if it goes over very specific guidelines, then the ship will no longer be Jones Act eligible.
So you not use it?
That you could use it in international trade, but you could not use it in a Jones Act trade.
Okay. How you study the consequences of the eradication of the cabotage law in Hawaii, and its effect in the economic development of the island.
Yes, we've examined the effect of cabotage on the economy of Hawaii. Because of the extraordinarily high cost of ship construction in the U.S., only a few ships and kinds of ships are built each year in the U.S. This creates an artificial shortage of ships in the Jones Act fleet. This has limited the ability to ship certain kinds of cargoes economically between Hawaii and the U.S. West Coast. It has been especially and adversely affected the agriculture and manufacturing sectors, limiting economic development.
So mostly the study that you have been done, is it that topic especially?
Would you repeat your question, please?
So is the topic that you have been studying that will be impacted by the elimination of the Jones Act will be especially in the topics that you already described to us?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. How have the people of Hawaii been affected by the increase of the freight cost, and how does this increase reflect in the cost of goods?
Yeah, in the past we have attempted to estimate the cost of the Jones Act to the consumer in Hawaii. We believe the annual Jones Act burden on the state of Hawaii is roughly about 2.5% of the gross state product, and about 3% burden on the state's personal income. About 13 years ago, we estimated this to be about $2,500 per household annually.
For some goods, especially for goods.
This is for everything. I mean, we used the analysis was excuse me. The analysis was done on a macro basis, so we looked at the overall cost of freight versus what this gross state product was and what personal income was to arrive at these figures.
Okay. So you have example of product that you study already, trying to explain to people, especially when they will buy something, what is the situation that they have with cabotage laws and without the cabotage law?
Yes, from what I understand, you're referring to the kinds of jobs that would be available for people on the shore side in the ports, doing work such as stevedoring, servicing vessels, ship agency, and the like.
Yes.
Yeah, in terms of shoreside employment, we are it is very unlikely that the flag of the vessel would make any difference in such employment, regardless of whether the ship is a U.S. flag or a foreign flag vessel. All these services would be needed and would have to be typically provided to a ship arriving in a port in Puerto Rico or a port in Hawaii or a port anywhere in the world.
So do you think that the employment will increase it?
Well, if the employment will not decrease, but the employment certainly could increase if there's additional shipping activity.
How do you think that a free market concept will reflect in the economy of non-contiguous trades?
When speaking about free trade, especially in the international sense, there are two separate and general conditions in terms of cabotage. First, consider the service side. That is, whether or not foreign flag ships are allowed in the domestic trades of a coastal country. The second is the merchandise trade consideration. That is whether or not the coastal states' cabotage laws have a domestic build requirement such as the Jones Act. Under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, otherwise known as GATT, and the World Trade Organization rules, the U.S. domestic build requirement is not allowed. However, the U.S. build requirement of the Jones Act and of the other cabotage laws has been grandfathered in under GATT and WTO. This has been a sore point in international trade negotiations. This includes the two current international trade negotiations, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership between the U.S. and the EU, and the Multilateral Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership.
So, especially in that, I'm just thinking about your testimony. So do you think that actually the cabotage, the elimination of especially the situation with the construction of the vessel will help? Absolutely. In the economic situation of the Hawaiian, sorry?
Oh, sure, yes. Basically, because it's 5 times more expensive to build a large ship in the United States, if you allow ship owners in the United States to import a vessel, put a U.S. flag and a U.S. crew on it, and then use it to carry cargo between domestic ports, this becomes a much less expensive proposition. The capital cost is much lower. There would be a much greater availability of ships, and this would bring competition and lower prices to these trade lanes.
So in that line, do you understand that the elimination of this restriction can affect in any matter the jobs of the port workers?
This will not affect the job of the port workers one iota, because the port workers are required no matter what the flag of the ship is.
Okay, so you are very clear about that.
Absolutely. There's no question about it. And this is a major concern for the longshoremen's unions. In your case, it's the ILA, and in our case here in Hawaii and Alaska, it is the ILWU. Those are two different longshore unions. They typically oppose any changes to the Jones Act because they are supporting their union brothers in the shipbuilding yards on the mainland.
Do you know if the state of Alaska already made efforts to be excluded for the application of the cabotage laws?
Yes, there is a long history of opposition to the Jones Act in Alaska, but there is no current initiative. The Territory of Alaska unsuccessfully sued the federal government in 1921, the year after the Jones Act was enacted. They wished to exempt the territory from the new law. That case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, but the territory lost on the basis of standing. During the Alaska statehood process in 1958, the Jones Act was a major issue. However, at the end of the day, Alaska accepted the Jones Act as a cost of statehood. The last major political figure in Alaska to be openly opposed to the Jones Act was the late Governor Wally Hickel. He served as governor from 1990 to 1994 as a member of the Alaska Independence Party. He previously served as Alaska's governor from 1966 to 1969 as a Republican. The current lieutenant governor of the state of Alaska, Meade Treadwell, is a protege of the late Governor Hickel. And Lieutenant Governor Treadwell is running for the U.S. Senate in the current election cycle. Although Lieutenant Governor Treadwell has spoken about the Jones Act in the past, he has not yet taken a formal position in the current campaign. So that's the status in Alaska right now.
Yeah, we are getting a connection with the people of Alaska, so we will do the same that we are doing with you today, with Alaska.
Yes, I am directly in contact with people in Alaska, including Lieutenant Governor Treadwell.
So we will be in touch with you later, trying to get that link to do some contacts in order to get that information.
Sure.
I already seen our document that we have here, the Senate Resolution 81, Hawaii State Senate. The bill says that you have severe restrictions in the industries of beef and pork because they are not American registered livestock carriers. Can you explain more about this matter?
Yes, I can. The animal husbandry industries in Hawaii are disadvantaged several ways by the Jones Act. First, because there are no self-propelled ocean-going Jones Act bulk carriers, means that we cannot bring in animal feed in bulk from the U.S. West Coast. Finished feeds are brought in by containers, which is a much more expensive option. Second, it is expensive to bring in ancillary supplies for the agricultural industry, and this, of course, affects all of the industries here in the islands. And third, the beef cattle industry in Hawaii has relied upon shipping live young animals to the U.S. West Coast for feeding and processing. Because of the semi-tropical climate here in Hawaii, the ranchers can breed a lot of young cattle, but there isn't the availability of pasture and feed, so that they prefer to ship their live young animals to the U.S. West Coast, where feed and pasture is more available, and this way they can increase their production. The problem with that particular business model is that the conventional way for shipping cattle and other stock animals is by specialized ships known as livestock carriers. There are no livestock carriers in the Jones Act fleet. There just is insufficient amount of business for a livestock carrier domestically, and so the only livestock carriers that are in operation in the world are all internationally flagged and not available for use between Hawaii and the U.S. West Coast. For a time, the Hawaii ranchers were shipping their cattle to Canada using foreign flag livestock carriers, but the economics of that have deteriorated, and so they are not doing that any longer. They would like to be able to use a foreign flag livestock carrier to carry their live young animals from Hawaii directly to U.S. West Coast ports, but of course that is prohibited by the Jones Act.
The same situation with the DNL carriers, though the cabotage law doesn't have that kind of vessels to carry all that GNL. It's the same situation. I'm sorry that I go backwards, but I want to ask you something before we go forward.
Sure.
So, do you tell us that the Alaska Independence Party realized efforts for eliminate the restrictions Can you explain us more what specific action they assume already?
I didn't understand. I did not understand your question. Could you repeat it, please?
You tell us already that the Alaska Independent Party is efforts for eliminate the restriction of the cabotage laws. Can you explain to us more or what specific action they already did or they do it before?
You're referring to the Alaska Independence Party. That was the party of the late Governor Wally Hickel. The Alaska Independence Party, as I understand it today, is not a very big party, and it has very little influence. The most influential candidate and office holder they ever had was Wally Hickel, and he is no longer with us.
Okay. Some studies suggest that entering domestic freight, no Jones Act carriers will have to comply with all federal laws, which, and the cost advantage will disappear or at least diminish. What are your comments about that?
Yeah, this is not completely true. The main Jones Act cross driver is the domestic build requirement and the cost of U.S. ship construction. Non-Jones Act qualified ships, that is, ships built someplace else, would certainly be a lower cost even with a U.S. crew. In respect of crewing costs, there are other considerations. If, for example, Puerto Rico were fully exempt from the Jones Act, then a ship owner could operate a foreign flag ship with a foreign crew carrying cargo between the U.S. mainland and Puerto Rico without contravening employment and other laws. Providing, however, the ship called at intermediate foreign ports to terminate its domestic voyage. That is, if Puerto Rico were fully exempt from the Jones Act, today you could use a foreign flag ship from Jacksonville, Florida, to carry cargo to San Juan, Puerto Rico. However, the ship would have to call and transact cargo at an intermediary foreign port, say, for example, in the Dominican Republic. And that would break the domestic voyage, create an international voyage, and the crew and the rest of the arrangements for that foreign flag ship would not violate U.S. law. If, on the other hand, the foreign flag ship were to operate exclusively between the U.S. mainland and Puerto Rico, there would be a problem with the employment of foreign crew members and many other regulatory issues such as business registration, taxation, etc. There are existing examples of this kind of operation. For example, Puerto Rico is exempt from the Passenger Vessel Services Act of 1886, which allows foreign flag cruise ships to carry passengers from a U.S. port to Puerto Rico. The way that the cruise ships deal with the foreign flag issue is by calling at an intermediary foreign port, breaking the domestic voyage. Also, in the case of the container ships operating between the U.S. West Coast and the territory of American Samoa, they do that with foreign flag ships that call it intermediary foreign ports as well. So there are examples of how to do this if, in the event, Puerto Rico was to become fully exempt from the Jones Act.
And I think that happened too to the Virgin Islands when they'll get all the elimination of the Jones Act.
Yes, the Virgin Islands have been exempt from the Jones Act since the day they were annexed by the United States from the Danish government, or they were sold by the Danish government to the United States during World War I. There was a side agreement to that international treaty that has kept the U.S. Virgin Islands exempt from the Jones Act.
I wanted that you be more specific. Some studies suggest that there is a cost premium associated with operating vessels under U.S. laws using U.S. crews versus operating vessels using third world crews. What are your comments about that?
Yes, it is certainly more expensive to operate a ship under the U.S. flag as opposed to what is known as a flag of convenience or FOC ship. Flag of convenience or FOC ships typically employ third world crews, as you mentioned. Not only are crewing costs higher on U.S. flag ships, but so are many other operating costs. The U.S. Maritime Administration, also known as MARAD, periodically establishes the differential between U.S. flag and FOC operating costs. This is done for the purpose of setting the Maritime Security Program, otherwise known as MSP, subsidy payments to U.S. flag ships. The government pays MSP subsidy of $3.5 million per ship per year for 60 ships in what is known as the U.S. flag international trade fleet. There are 89 ships in this fleet, and they are all foreign built, and approximately half of them are actually foreign owned through a U.S. owning company. In the last of these reports, which was entitled Comparison of U.S. and Foreign Flag Operating Costs, issued in September 2011. In that report, it was stated the U.S. flag operating cost in 2010 was 2.7%, 2.7 times greater than that for a flag of convenience. The operating cost for a typical 2,500 TEU container ship under U.S. flag was $21,000 per day versus an FOC cost of $9,500 per day.
A well-known study argues that internationally, ocean freight rates have gone through major transformation, stabilized, and moved up at a rapid pace in mid-2011. A comparison between the global freight rate in January of this year of 2,713 FEU with that estimate for Puerto Rico domestic trade for the 2011 of 1,810 FEU shows that the average rate for international service is 33% higher than for Puerto Rico. What are your thoughts about this?
I do not know what report you're referring to. I suspect it may be the report that Estudios Técnicos did for the Maritime Alliance.
Yes.
Yeah. As I understand the reference, it is comparing apples and oranges. Freight rates must be compared between similar port pairs to result in useful data. The value of global rate, an average global rate, has very little relation to a local rate on a particular trade lane. Also, currently, the international container shipping business is suffering from very low rates. And so I wonder where these numbers came from. For example, when the New York Fed examined the Puerto Rico trade in comparison to trades from the U.S. mainland to other Caribbean destinations, they found that the rates, the foreign flag rates to the other Caribbean destinations were significantly lower than those to Puerto Rico. And this was roughly in the same time frame as the Estudios report. And also in the GAO report, they said that they were unable to get liner container freight rates from the carriers, which seems a bit odd because the New York Fed was apparently able to discover those rates quite readily.
Yeah, that is my question, because it's supposedly, the Marat is supposedly to have that rate, and the Fed and the American Fed too have that rate. So that is the same question that I ask you because that is a coincidence that in the GEO report they said that, but some months later we get another study that already get it. And for example, we don't know from where they get all that data, especially the comparison between the international grain cost and the cost of Puerto Rico already.
Right. From what I understand of the Estudios report is that they took average global freight rates, say rates from Europe to Asia, from Asia to North America, took all those global rates, came up, and that kind of rate information is available from some of the large maritime consultancy companies, so that they could access that kind of information, and then they compared that to local rates between the U.S. Mainland and Puerto Rico. That's not really a valid comparison. The comparison that the New York Fed did is far more a valid comparison, because they compared the freight rates from the U.S. mainland to Puerto Rico versus the freight rates from the U.S. mainland to nearby other Caribbean destinations. That is a reasonable comparison. Comparing freight rates in the Puerto Rico domestic trade to what the global average freight rate is not a reasonable comparison.
So, for maybe later, can we get from you the really cost of that freight? And for example, you can get some comments on that, especially the cost that is getting from the comparison between the international or grain vessels and the Puerto Rico too. Can we get that information from you?
Yes, I'll be able to give you some assistance with that. But the New York Fed report is a very good place to start. Now, the carriers in the domestic Puerto Rico trade, they file their rates with what is known as the Surface Transportation Board. That's a federal agency. And the carriers that are operating in the foreign trade of the United States, in this instance, from the U.S. mainland to other Caribbean destinations, they file their freight rates with the Federal Maritime Commission. So those rates are publicly available.
Okay, thank you. A study indicates that no government or private entity, including international carriers, has presented a study or proposal as to how international lines can deliver better service or lower cost proposition to Puerto Rico on the assumption that the Jones Act is repealed. Do you know if any of these international lines have delivered a cost proposition, to Hawaii in case that the Jones Act is repealed?
Yeah, this is a question that that the defenders of the Jones Act raise quite a bit. It's really a chicken or egg type question. That is, what comes first, the repeal or the proposal? Certainly there are a number of international ocean carriers who would be well positioned to provide foreign flag liner services to Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the other non-contiguous trades if they were exempted from the Jones Act. For example, in the U.S. West Coast American Samoa trade, two very reliable major foreign flag services are provided by large international operators. The two operators in the American Samoa trade are Hamburg Sud, and the other is Schweiers Shipping. They're within the top 20 large shipping companies. I don't think that an international liner operator would be inclined to offer a concrete service proposal to serve Puerto Rico, Guam, Hawaii, or Alaska based upon the highly unlikely event of Jones Act repeal. That's why I say, you know, it's a chicken or the egg situation. What comes first, the proposal or the repeal? And there is an awfully good example in the America-Samoa trade of two very respectable large shipping companies providing reliable service to American Samoa.
I have another question. Some studies suggest too that the sizes of the containers is an issue. For example, the 53 feet, 48 feet, and the 45 feet are not commonly used or available in the international trade. These studies have been established that the evolution of this container size plays a critical role in driving greater efficiencies for shippers and cargo owners. Do you have some comments about that?
Yes, I believe that's from the Estudios report again. They made a major claim that only because we have Jones Act ships that that Puerto Rico is able to receive what they call oversized containers, containers longer than 40 feet and higher than the normal height of a container. All the major international container carriers carry oversized containers in this day and age. That's not really an issue at all.
So that is not an issue that will put something in place that will put in risk our economic development or the proposals that can bring or can be sent by other carriers as a foreign carriers.
Sure.
Here in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, basically that is a canard. If Puerto Rico were fully exempted from the Jones Act and foreign carriers could operate foreign flag ships between the U.S. mainland and Puerto Rico, if there was a demand for oversized containers, the foreign operators would certainly meet that demand.
I have another question in that it's been explained or described in the Senate resolution. Says basically there is some restrictions that will result in an immense unfair burden of higher costs, elevate cost of living for one, Hawaii, Alaska, and Puerto Rico, and severely treats the health and the security of the residents and visitors in the event of disruption in the delivery of food, fuel, food, or other goods. What do you think about that? Because we are talking here about a situation of emergency that can be in our faces, and we are just explaining the cost or other situations, but not the situation that is called an emergency or national emergency, for example.
Sure. I think what you're referring to there is the question about service reliability.
Yes.
The Jones Act industry tries to create a boogeyman out of foreign ship operators, and they say that it's only because of the Jones Act and the U.S. shipping industry that places like Hawaii and Puerto Rico can enjoy reliable service. And
yes.
especially in times of national emergency and disasters and that sort of thing.
Yes.
I believe this is another canard. You know, the whole world operates on just-in-time inventories, and these just-in-time inventories are moved between places like Europe and Asia, and in the transatlantic trades by almost exclusively by foreign flagships, and the same in the Trans-Pacific. And these carriers, these foreign flag international container operators, all meet very high service standards, including what they call day-of-the-week service. The ships arrive in port on the same day each week. And they are able to achieve this on a very large scale. So I think servicing the very small markets of Hawaii and Puerto Rico should not be a problem.
Another purpose of the Resolution 237 on cabotage laws is trying to explain to the United Nations a situation here that maybe will deal with civil rights. So if we in Puerto Rico made an effort to go to the United Nations, we send a request for the session, can your group be available to support us?
Yeah, I'm not sure that you have a claim at the United Nations. I believe Puerto Rico is on the list of non-self-governing territories. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. The issue of cabotage is closely related to political status. Generally, I don't like to use the term repeal of the Jones Act, as that necessarily means a full nationwide repeal, which is not likely to ever occur, and is far beyond the scope of what we can realistically accomplish in the domestic offshore area. I think the best approach for the non-contiguous jurisdictions should be seeking exemptions from the Jones Act with respect to the non-contiguous trades. A full exemption from cabotage exists today for American Samoa, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. This full exemption from the Jones Act is unlikely to be obtained given the current status, political status of Alaska, Guam, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. Statehood all but precludes a full exemption. However, Puerto Rico and Guam, at least theoretically, have the option of moving towards the kind of enhanced Commonwealth status that the CNMI, or the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas Islands, currently has today. In the international treaty that provided for the annexation of the Northern Mariana Islands, that treaty specifically exempted them from maritime cabotage. Presumably, if the people of Puerto Rico wish to move towards an advanced or enhanced Commonwealth status along the lines of what the CNMI has today, that could become part of your negotiations. This is a similar situation to Guam. I've spoken to some of the people in Guam who are negotiating political status issues with the U.S. government, and they would like to. There is a portion of the population which would like to move towards an advanced or enhanced Commonwealth status, similar to the Northern Mariana Islands, which are right next door to Guam. And one of the issues that they have on their agenda is a full Jones Act exemption. I think that is the arena where Puerto Rico and Guam would have the best opportunity for pursuing a full exemption from the Jones Act, which would allow foreign flag shipping between the U.S. and Puerto Rico, for example. However, if you move in the other direction to statehood, as some people in Puerto Rico advocate for, then I think you're looking at the same sort of situation that Alaska had to accept when they sought statehood in 1958. In the case of Hawaii and Alaska, now that they are states of the Union, the best solution for them is, in my opinion, is seeking an exemption from the build issue and several other items that make U.S. flag shipping more expensive. The idea would be to reduce the cost of U.S. flag shipping in the non-contiguous trades by allowing foreign-built ships in, by allowing those ships to be reconstructed in a foreign place, and of several other exemptions from current U.S. law that would make those operations more efficient. So I think, you know, if you decide to go in the statehood direction, it's probably unlikely that you're going to ever get a full exemption from the Jones Act. If you move to advanced or enhanced Commonwealth status along the lines of the Northern Marianas Islands, then I think that can become part of your negotiating agenda. And perhaps the UN, through the Committee on Decolonization, may be able to assist in that regard.
Overall, will you conclude that having chips built outside of the U.S. will solve most of the problems caused by the Jones Act, such as energy, environment, cost to import and export, efficiency, or timeless?
Yes, it would be a very good first step, let's say, that would solve many of the problems. It wouldn't solve all the problems. For example, the Hawaii ranchers would still not be able to use a foreign flag livestock carrier to the U.S. mainland, but it would solve many of the problems we currently have.
Well, Mr. Hansen, I don't know if you have any other comments. I don't have more questions. Finally, what exception or exceptions do you think we should pursue from Johnson political status as a territory?
Given your current political status, I think Puerto Rico's best option at this particular time is to pursue an exemption from the U.S. build requirement along with the other non-contiguous jurisdictions and see if we can bring enough political pressure to bear on the Congress to enact such an exemption.
Well, thank you, Mr. Hansen, to be with us today, doing history here too in Puerto Rico too, through this public hearing. Thank you for your response and all the information that you have been bringing to us today. Thank you for every comment that you get, and also I would like that you send our regards to the resolution 81. Thank you for integrating Puerto Rico in that resolution. For us, it's very support action that will help us with you together in Hawaii to do what we need to do in order to get economic growth and actually and finally a better quality of life of Puerto Ricans as the Hawaiians too.
Well, thank you very much, Senator. I appreciate you having me through this historical event on Skype to testify before your committee on this very important matter to our two respective jurisdictions.
Thank you, and good morning and the rest of the day. And you know that you can be in touch with us, and we will be in touch with you for any other question that we have about this station.
Thank you. I look forward to hearing your questions, and good afternoon, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.